Russia is out of the war. America is pouring across the Atlantic. And in the West, German high command is preparing one final, all-or-nothing gamble to win the war before American strength can tip the balance for good. In the spring of 1918, Germany has one last chance to win the First World War, and its generals know it. With Russia knocked out of the conflict, nearly 1 million German soldiers have been freed from the Eastern Front and rushed west for a single, colossal gamble. Break the Allied lines before American troops arrive in overwhelming numbers, or lose the war for good. What follows is one of the most dramatic reversals in military history, a shattering German offensive that comes closer to winning the war than anything since 1914, followed by a stunning Allied counteroffensive that will finally, after 4 years of stalemate, restore movement to the Western Front and drive the once invincible German army to the brink of collapse. In this final chapter of our story, we witness the last 100 days of the deadliest war the world has ever known, the collapse of 4 empires within the span of a single year, an armistice signed in a railway carriage in a French forest, and a peace conference in Versailles that will end one world war while planting, almost unknowingly, the seeds of an even more terrible one just 20 years later. The German offensive begins on March 21, 1918, under General Erich Ludendorff, using innovative new stormtrooper infiltration tactics, small, elite squads bypassing strong points to strike deep into Allied rear areas rather than attacking in the massed, slow-moving waves that had defined so much of the previous 3 years. Operation Michael, the first of what will become known as the Spring Offensives, tears a massive hole in British lines near the Old Somme battlefield, advancing further in a single week than either side has managed in years of previous fighting. For a brief, terrifying moment, it appears Germany might actually win the war outright. Paris itself comes under fire from a monstrous long-range gun, and panicked plans are drawn up for evacuating the French capital yet again. But the German offensives, for all their tactical brilliance, carry a fatal strategic flaw. They lack the mobility, enough motor transport, enough fresh horses, enough supply capacity to exploit their own breakthroughs before Allied reserves can plug each new gap. German infantry, many of them malnourished after years of the British naval blockade, are reportedly stunned to discover well-stocked Allied supply depots as they advance, sometimes stopping to loot food and alcohol rather than pressing the attack. A small but telling symbol of just how exhausted and depleted the German war economy has become. By July 1918, after a series of offensives, Michael, Georgette, Blucher, York, and finally a last gasp at the Second Battle of the Marne, German forces have advanced dramatically on the map but achieved no decisive breakthrough, and have suffered irreplaceable casualties among their most experienced assault troops in the process. The Allies, reinforced now by hundreds of thousands of fresh, well-fed American soldiers arriving under General John J. Pershing, seized the initiative. On August 8, 1918, a date German commander Erich Ludendorff himself will later call the Black Day of the German Army. British, French, Australian, Canadian, and American forces launch a devastating coordinated counteroffensive near Amiens, employing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in a genuinely modern combined arms assault that finally cracks German defenses. This begins what historians call the 100 Days Offensive, a sustained Allied advance that, unlike almost anything else in the war's previous 4 years, does not stop. German forces, increasingly composed of exhausted reserves and reluctant conscripts, begin falling back along the entire Western Front, abandoning the formidable Hindenburg Line defenses that had seemed impregnable only months before. The military collapse in the West is mirrored by political and social collapse across the Central Powers. Bulgaria, exhausted and facing an Allied breakthrough from the Salonika front in the Balkans, signs an armistice in late September 1918, the first of the Central Powers to fall. The Ottoman Empire, having suffered catastrophic losses across multiple fronts from Mesopotamia to Palestine, follows in late October. Austria-Hungary, the ancient multi-ethnic empire that had triggered the entire war in 1914, simply disintegrates from within as Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and Hungarians all declare independence within weeks of each other in October and November 1918, and Vienna signs its own armistice on November 3rd. Germany itself, facing military defeat, naval mutiny at Kiel where sailors refuse orders for one final, suicidal fleet engagement, and open revolution spreading rapidly through its major cities, sees Kaiser Wilhelm II forced to abdicate on November 9, 1918, and flee into exile in the Netherlands. A new German republic, proclaimed amid chaos in Berlin, immediately sends a delegation to negotiate an armistice. In a railway carriage in the Forest of Compiègne, at 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 1918, German representatives sign an armistice with the Allies. The fighting officially ends at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A moment of such deliberate symbolic precision that it will be commemorated in ceremonies of remembrance around the world for more than a century afterward. The final human cost of the war is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Roughly 9 to 11 million military personnel are dead, alongside a comparable number of civilian deaths from causes ranging from famine and disease to the genocide of Ottoman Armenians carried out amid the chaos of the war years. Millions more are left maimed, blinded, or psychologically shattered by an experience for which no soldier of any previous generation had been remotely prepared. For great empires, the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman, have utterly ceased to exist, replaced by a patchwork of new and fragile nation-states across Central and Eastern Europe whose borders will remain sources of conflict for decades to come. In January 1919, representatives of the victorious Allied powers gather at the Paris Peace Conference to determine the terms of peace, dominated by the so-called Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Wilson arrives with idealistic ambitions embodied in his 14 points, envisioning national self-determination and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Clemenceau, representing a France that has been physically devastated and has lost proportionally more young men than any other major combatant, wants above all to permanently cripple Germany's capacity to ever threaten France again. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 in the very same Hall of Mirrors where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, reflects an uneasy and, in retrospect, deeply unstable compromise between these competing visions. Germany is stripped of significant territory in both the East and West. Its overseas colonies are seized and redistributed among the victors as League of Nations mandates. Its military is severely restricted, and, most controversially and consequentially of all, Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, forces Germany to formally accept sole responsibility for the war and to pay enormous financial reparations to the Allied powers. German delegates, excluded from the negotiations themselves and presented with the treaty essentially as a fait accompli, denounce it as a national humiliation, a diktat imposed at gunpoint rather than a negotiated peace. This sense of grievance, historians widely agree, will fester within German society for the next 2 decades, providing fertile ideological ground that a failed Austrian painter and army veteran named Adolf Hitler will exploit with devastating success. The League of Nations, Wilson's cherished vision for preventing future wars through collective security, is established by the treaty, but the United States Senate, in a bitter domestic political battle, ultimately refuses to ratify American membership, crippling the organization's authority and credibility from its very inception. Meanwhile, the promise of national self-determination, applied unevenly and often for the political convenience of the victorious powers rather than as a consistent principle, leaves numerous ethnic minorities dissatisfied within the borders of the new states carved from the fallen empires. Grievances that will help fuel further conflicts across Central and Eastern Europe for years, and in some cases decades, to come. The First World War had been called, with tragic, misplaced optimism, the war to end all wars. Instead, the peace that ended it left behind a world of shattered empires, humiliated nations, unresolved ethnic tensions, and a devastating global influenza pandemic sweeping through populations already weakened by 4 years of war and privation, killing tens of millions more in 1918 and 1919 alone. Within a single generation, the unresolved bitterness of Versailles, the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, and the rise of totalitarian ideologies across Europe would combine to produce a second, even more catastrophic global conflict. The guns that fell silent in the Forest of Compiègne in November 1918 had not, in truth, ended the age of total war. They had only paused it. The First World War remade the modern world in ways still visible today, in the borders of Europe and the Middle East, in the technologies of industrialized warfare, in the political ideologies that would soon reshape the 20th century, and in the collective memory of nations that still gather every November to remember the millions who never came home. It began with a single gunshot in a city few outside Europe could have located on a map, and it ended with empires in ruins and a peace so flawed that, within 2 decades, the world would be forced to fight it all over again. This has been the complete story of the war that was meant to end all wars, and the fragile, fractured peace that instead set the stage for the next one.